In the early 1970s, heroin was destroying New York City. Hundreds of thousands of people were addicted, overdoses were rampant, and entire neighborhoods were devastated. At the center of this epidemic was one man, Frank Lucas, a former driver and enforcer who became the most powerful drug dealer in Harlem. Frank revolutionized the heroin trade by cutting out the middlemen and smuggling pure heroin directly from Southeast Asia in the coffins of dead American soldiers. At his peak, he was making $1 million per day. He lived in mansions, wore mink coats, and flaunted his wealth so brazenly that he attracted the attention of an honest cop who would bring him down. His story inspired the movie American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington. But the real story is even more complex, controversial, and devastating than any Hollywood film. This is the true story of Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas was born on September 9, 1930, in La Grange, North Carolina, a small town in the rural South. He grew up in extreme poverty during the Great Depression and the Jim Crow era, when Black Americans faced systemic racism, limited opportunities, and constant threats of violence. Frank witnessed this brutality firsthand when he was just 6 years old. His cousin was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan for allegedly looking at a white woman. The killers were never prosecuted. This traumatic experience shaped young Frank's worldview. There was no justice, no fairness, only power and survival. Frank's childhood was marked by poverty and violence. His father was abusive and abandoned the family. His mother struggled to feed 12 children. Frank grew up hungry, wearing hand-me-down clothes, and watching white people in his town live comfortable lives while black families starved. He learned early that the system wasn't designed to help people like him. If he wanted to escape poverty, he would have to do it himself, by any means necessary. As a teenager, Frank turned to crime. He started with petty theft, stealing chickens and food to help feed his family. But the turning point came when he was a teenager and witnessed a white man assault his mother. Frank grabbed a pipe and beat the man severely. Knowing he would face severe consequences in the racist South, likely lynching, Frank fled north to New York City. He arrived in Harlem in the late 1940s, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to never be poor or powerless again. Harlem in the late 1940s and 1950s was a vibrant but dangerous place. It was the cultural capital of Black America, home to jazz clubs, theaters, and a thriving arts scene. But it was also plagued by poverty, police corruption, and organized crime. The Italian Mafia controlled most of the racket's gambling, numbers running, loan sharking, and drugs. For a young black man with no education and no connections, legitimate opportunities were scarce. Frank did what many did. He turned to the streets. Frank started as a small-time hustler, running errands for local criminals, stealing and doing whatever it took to survive. He was smart, observant, and willing to work harder than anyone else. These qualities caught the attention of Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, the most powerful black gangster in Harlem. Bumpy was a legend in the neighborhood, a man who had stood up to the Italian Mafia and carved out his own territory. Bumpy saw potential in young Frank and took him under his wing. For 15 years, Frank worked as Bumpy Johnson's driver, bodyguard, and enforcer. This wasn't just a job. It was an education. Bumpy taught Frank how the criminal underworld worked. He showed him how to build relationships, how to handle money, how to survive in a world where betrayal was constant and violence was always an option. Bumpy also taught Frank about dignity and respect. Despite being a criminal, Bumpy had principles. He took care of the community, helped people in need, and commanded respect through more than just fear. Frank absorbed everything Bumpy taught him. He watched how Bumpy negotiated with the Italian Mafia, how he managed his operations, and how he stayed ahead of law enforcement. But Frank also saw Bumpy's limitations. Bumpy was old school. He was content to maintain his territory and work within the system the Italians had established. Frank had bigger ambitions. He didn't want to work for the Italians or pay them tribute. He wanted to build his own empire, independent and more profitable than anything Harlem had seen before. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in Frank's arms at a Harlem restaurant. Frank was devastated. Bumpy had been like a father to him, the most important mentor in his life. But Bumpy's death also created an opportunity. There was now a power vacuum in Harlem's drug trade. Various criminals competed to fill it, expecting Frank to be just another player. But Frank had a plan that would change everything. At that time, the heroin trade was controlled by the Italian Mafia. They imported heroin from the French Connection, a network that smuggled opium from Turkey through France and into New York. The Mafia then sold to wholesalers, who sold to dealers, who sold to users. Each level added markup, cutting the product with additives to increase profits. By the time heroin reached users, it was only 5 to 10% pure. This system made the Mafia rich, but Frank saw its weakness. Too many middlemen taking cuts and diluting the product. Frank came up with an audacious idea: cut out all the middlemen and go directly to the source. The Vietnam War was raging in Southeast Asia, and the Golden Triangle, the region where Thailand, Laos, and Burma meet, was producing massive amounts of high-quality opium. Frank decided he would travel to Southeast Asia, establish direct connections with heroin producers, and smuggle the product back to America himself. It was risky, unprecedented for a black American dealer, and absolutely brilliant. In 1968, Frank flew to Bangkok, Thailand. He didn't speak the language, didn't know anyone, and was walking into one of the most dangerous drug-producing regions in the world. But Frank was fearless. He made contact with Chinese and Thai drug producers in the Golden Triangle. He negotiated deals directly with the suppliers, offering to buy in massive quantities. The suppliers were skeptical at first. Who was this American offering to buy hundreds of kilos? But Frank's cash and confidence convinced them. Then came the most controversial and ingenious part of Frank's operation: the smuggling method. According to Frank's own accounts, he bribed American military personnel and used the bodies of dead American soldiers being shipped home from Vietnam to smuggle heroin. The coffins of these fallen soldiers would have hidden compartments filled with pure heroin. The coffins flew on military planes, went through military channels with less scrutiny than civilian flights, and arrived in the United States, where Frank's people would retrieve the drugs. This claim remains one of the most controversial aspects of Frank's story. Using the bodies of American soldiers as drug mules is so shocking and disrespectful that many questioned whether it actually happened. Some investigators and journalists have cast doubt on Frank's story, suggesting he exaggerated or fabricated this detail. Others believe it's true, pointing to the scale of Frank's operation and the purity of his product as evidence that he had an unprecedented smuggling method. Whether true or exaggerated, the story became legendary and central to Frank's mystique. What is undisputed is that Frank Lucas flooded Harlem with heroin that was far purer and cheaper than anything available. His product, which he branded Blue Magic, was 90 to 100% pure, nearly 10 times stronger than the diluted heroin coming through the Italian Mafia. Users could get higher for less money, and dealers could cut it themselves and still have a superior product. Blue Magic became the brand name for quality heroin in New York, and Frank became phenomenally wealthy. At his peak in the early 1970s, Frank Lucas was one of the richest criminals in America. He later claimed he was making $1 million per day, likely an exaggeration. But even if it was half that, the numbers were staggering. Frank owned properties throughout New York and New Jersey. He bought apartment buildings in Harlem and rented them cheaply to residents, positioning himself as a benefactor to the community even as his drugs destroyed it. He had a beautiful mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey, where he lived with his wife and children. He owned a fleet of luxury cars, and he dressed in expensive suits and furs, determined to look successful. This ostentatious display of wealth would prove to be Frank's downfall, but at the time, it felt like vindication. Frank Lucas, the poor kid from North Carolina who had fled the Ku Klux Klan, who had arrived in New York with nothing, was now richer than the white people who had oppressed him. He was richer than the Italian mobsters who had controlled Harlem. He had beaten the system that was designed to keep him down. In Frank's mind, he was living the American dream just through illegal means. Frank's operation wasn't just about him. He brought in family members, particularly his brothers, to help run the organization. This created loyalty, but also complications. Frank trusted family more than outsiders, which is smart in the drug trade, where betrayal is common. But it also meant that when law enforcement eventually targeted him, they could pressure his family members to cooperate. Frank built a network of dealers throughout Harlem and the tri-state area, all selling blue magic heroin. He employed enforcers to protect his territory and eliminate rivals. He had lawyers, accountants, and legitimate businesses to launder money. It was a sophisticated criminal empire. But Frank made a critical mistake. He attracted attention. In 1970, Frank attended the Muhammad Ali vs. Joe Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden. It was called the Fight of the Century, and celebrities, politicians, and wealthy New Yorkers filled the arena. Frank showed up wearing a $100,000 chinchilla fur coat and a matching hat, sitting ringside with his wife, draped in diamonds and furs. He looked like royalty, and he wanted everyone to know it. In the crowd that night was Detective Richie Roberts of the Essex County Prosecutor's Office in New Jersey. Roberts was an honest cop, a rarity in an era when police corruption was rampant. He noticed Frank Lucas at the fight. This black man wearing a fortune in furs, while most of Harlem struggled in poverty and addiction. Roberts didn't know who Frank was, but he knew something was wrong. He started investigating. Who is this guy? Where does his money come from? That investigation would take years, but it would eventually bring down Frank Lucas's empire. Richie Roberts was an interesting character himself. He was a former military man, a lawyer, and a cop with a reputation for honesty that actually hurt his career. In the 1960s, Roberts and his partner found nearly $1 million in cash in a car during a drug bust. Every other cop would have taken at least some of it, but Roberts turned in every penny. His honesty made him an outcast among corrupt cops. But it also made him the perfect person to investigate Frank Lucas without being bought off. Roberts and his team began building a case against Frank. It was slow, painstaking work. Frank didn't handle drugs directly. He insulated himself through layers of family and associates. He laundered money through legitimate businesses. And he had enough wealth to hire top lawyers and, if necessary, bribe officials. But Roberts was relentless. He used wiretaps, surveillance, and confidential informants. He followed the money, tracing Frank's real estate purchases and business investments. And slowly, he built a case. Meanwhile, Frank's empire was at its peak, but also beginning to show cracks. The Italian Mafia was furious that a black dealer had cut them out and was dominating their territory. They put pressure on Frank, sometimes through violence. Competitors wanted his territory. Law enforcement was closing in. And Frank's flashy lifestyle, the furs, the cars, the mansions, had made him a target. In the drug game, the smart money stays quiet and invisible. Frank had become a celebrity, and that would cost him everything. In January 1975, Frank Lucas was arrested as part of a massive drug bust. Roberts and his team had built an airtight case. They had wiretaps of Frank discussing drug deals. They had surveillance footage. They had financial records showing unexplained wealth. And crucially, they had cooperating witnesses from Frank's organization who agreed to testify. Frank was charged with federal drug trafficking conspiracy, and the evidence was overwhelming. Frank faced life in prison. At 44 years old, having built an empire from nothing, he was looking at dying in a federal penitentiary. The feds offered him a choice: cooperate, provide information on corrupt cops and your suppliers, and we'll reduce your sentence. Or stay silent, protect the code of the streets, and never see freedom again. Frank made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He cooperated. Frank's decision to become a government witness shocked the criminal underworld. This was the 1970s, before cooperation was common. In that era, cooperating with law enforcement was considered the ultimate betrayal. Frank didn't just testify against other drug dealers. He provided information about corrupt cops, dirty lawyers, and politicians on the take. His testimony helped convict dozens of people, including numerous police officers who had been protecting drug operations in exchange for bribes. The most significant part of Frank's cooperation was exposing police corruption. He testified that 3/4 of the narcotics officers in New York were on the take, accepting bribes to ignore drug operations. This wasn't hyperbole. Investigations confirmed widespread corruption. Frank's testimony led to the prosecution of numerous officers and a massive cleanup of the NYPD Narcotics Division. 2 law enforcement officials fighting corruption, Frank became a valuable asset. To the streets, he became a rat, a snitch, someone who violated the code. In exchange for his cooperation, Frank's sentence was reduced from life to 15 years. In 1981, after serving only 6 years, he was released on parole. Frank Lucas, who had once made $1 million a day, walked out of prison with nothing. His assets had been seized. His empire was destroyed. His reputation in the streets was ruined. And he was now a marked man. There were people who wanted revenge for his testimony. Frank tried to live a legitimate life after prison. He attempted various business ventures, tried to go straight. But adjusting to normal life after being a kingpin was nearly impossible. In 1984, just 3 years after his release, Frank was arrested again on drug charges. He had returned to dealing, unable to resist the lure of easy money. This time, his sentence was harsh. 7 more years in federal prison. His second chance was gone. Frank was released again in 1991, having now spent a total of 13 years behind bars. By this point, he was 60 years old, and the world had changed. The crack epidemic had replaced heroin as the primary drug crisis. A new generation of dealers controlled the streets. Frank was a relic from another era, known by older criminals, but mostly forgotten by the younger generation. He settled into a quiet life in New Jersey with his wife, trying to stay out of trouble and out of prison. But Frank's story wasn't over. In the 2000s, there was renewed interest in his life. A magazine article profiled him, detailing his incredible rise and fall. Hollywood took notice, and in 2007, the movie American Gangster was released. Directed by Ridley Scott and starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas and Russell Crowe as Richie Roberts. The film was a massive success, grossing over $260 million worldwide, and introducing Frank's story to millions of people who had never heard of him. The movie portrayed Frank as a complex anti-hero, ruthless and criminal, but also intelligent, ambitious, and in some ways admirable. Denzel Washington's charismatic performance made Frank sympathetic, a man trying to succeed in a system designed to keep him down. The film glossed over or minimized many of the devastating consequences of Frank's drug empire, focusing instead on his business acumen and his battle against corrupt cops and the mafia. It was entertainment, not documentary, and it turned Frank Lucas into a legend. The real Frank Lucas had complicated feelings about the movie. He loved the attention and the fact that his story was told by Hollywood Alice, but he also complained that the film got many details wrong, that it exaggerated some things and downplayed others. In interviews after the film's release, Frank continued to claim that he had smuggled heroin in soldiers' coffins, though this remained disputed by investigators and journalists who found little evidence to support it. Some critics argued that the movie and Frank's subsequent celebrity glorified a man who had caused immense harm. Frank's heroin empire contributed to hundreds of thousands of addictions, countless overdose deaths, and the destruction of communities. Families were torn apart. Children grew up with addicted parents. People died in alleys with needles in their arms, poisoned by the very product Frank had marketed as blue magic. The human cost of Frank's empire was staggering, and some felt that lionizing him in film was disrespectful to his victims. Frank defended himself by arguing that he was a product of his environment. He grew up in poverty, witnessed racism and violence, and saw no legitimate path to success. The drug trade was simply a business opportunity, and he took it. He pointed out that if he hadn't sold heroin, someone else would have. The demand was already there. He also noted that he contributed to his community, helping people in Harlem even as his drugs poisoned them. These rationalizations were common among drug dealers, and they contained some truth, but they also conveniently ignored the suffering Frank's business caused. In his later years, Frank tried to position himself as a reformed criminal who could teach young people to avoid his mistakes. He gave interviews warning kids about the drug game, about how it all eventually ends in death or prison. He spoke about the emptiness of material wealth when it comes at the cost of morality. Some saw this as genuine redemption. Others saw it as an old man trying to sanitize his legacy. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Frank's relationship with Richie Roberts, the cop who brought him down, was particularly interesting. After Frank's cooperation, he and Roberts developed a strange mutual respect. Roberts acknowledged that Frank was brilliant in his way, a criminal genius who had outsmarted the system for years. Frank respected Roberts as one of the few honest cops in a corrupt system. They occasionally spoke publicly together, an odd pairing of cop and criminal who had been enemies but were now connected by history. The question of how much Frank actually made and how powerful he really was remains debated. Frank claimed at various times that he was making anywhere from $50,000 to $1 million per day at his peak. Investigators were skeptical of the higher figures, suggesting Frank exaggerated to enhance his legend. What is certain is that Frank was wealthy enough to buy significant real estate, live in luxury, and attract the attention of federal law enforcement. Whether he made hundreds of millions or only tens of millions, he was undeniably one of the most successful drug dealers of his era. The coffins story remains the most controversial aspect of Frank's legacy. He consistently claimed throughout his life that he smuggled heroin in the coffins of dead soldiers returning from Vietnam. This story was central to the American Gangster film and became the defining image of his operation. However, DHNs who investigated Frank, including those who worked with him during his cooperation, have said they found no evidence of coffin smuggling. They believe Frank used other methods, possibly bribing military personnel to smuggle drugs through military mail or on military flights, but not in coffins. Some think Frank invented or embellished the coffin story to make himself seem more daring and ingenious than he was. Why would Frank lie about this? Perhaps because the coffin story made him legendary. It was so audacious, so disrespectful to American military honor, and so brilliant in its evil genius that it captured people's imagination. A drug dealer smuggling drugs through normal channels is ordinary. A drug dealer using dead soldiers as mules is unforgettable. If Frank exaggerated this detail, it worked. The coffin story became the most famous part of his legend, ensuring his place in criminal history. The impact of Frank's operation on Harlem and the broader black community is complicated. On one hand, Frank provided jobs and money in a neighborhood where both were scarce. He helped people pay rent, he invested in local businesses, and he positioned himself as a community benefactor. Many residents appreciated his generosity and saw him as someone who had beaten the white establishment at their own game. On the other hand, Frank's heroin destroyed the community. Addiction devastated families. Crime increased as addicts stole to support their habits. Children grew up in environments poisoned by drugs. The community support Frank provided was vastly outweighed by the harm his product caused. This duality, criminal destroyer and community helper, is common among drug kingpins. They rationalize their crimes by pointing to their charity, as if helping some people justifies poisoning many more. Frank Lucas followed this pattern. He genuinely believed he was helping Harlem, that his success was a victory for Black Americans against a racist system. But he was also deeply in denial about the suffering his business model required. Comparisons between Frank Lucas and other legendary drug dealers are inevitable. Compared to Pablo Escobar, Frank was small-scale. Escobar moved exponentially more drugs and made billions. Compared to Rifle Edmond or Alpo Martinez, Frank operated in an earlier era with less competition and less law enforcement sophistication. But Frank's innovation, going directly to the source and cutting out middlemen, was genuinely revolutionary. He changed how the heroin trade worked, at least temporarily, and inspired other dealers to seek direct connections with suppliers. Frank's cooperation also set a precedent. In the 1970s, major drug dealers rarely cooperated with law enforcement. The code of silence was strong, and being labeled a snitch was a fate worse than prison. Frank broke that code, showing that even kingpins would talk if the alternative was dying in prison. After Frank, cooperation became more common. In the 1980s and 90s, numerous major dealers followed Frank's example, testifying against associates and rivals to reduce their sentences. Frank helped normalize something that had previously been unthinkable. On May 30, 2019, Frank Lucas died of natural causes in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. He was 88 years old. By the time of his death, he had been out of the drug game for decades and was living quietly with his family. His death received significant media coverage, with obituaries recounting his rise from poverty to becoming one of America's most notorious drug dealers. Some remembered him as a criminal genius, others as a destructor of communities. Both views were true. Frank's legacy is complicated and controversial. He was a man who overcame impossible odds, growing up black and poor in Jim Crow, North Carolina, fleeing to New York with nothing, and building an empire in a world controlled by white organized crime. His story is, in some ways, a perverted version of the American dream. Immigrant comes to America, or, in this case, moves north, works hard, innovates, outcompetes established businesses, and becomes wealthy. The fact that his product was heroin and his business destroyed lives doesn't change the fact that his rise required intelligence, courage, and business acumen. But Frank Lucas was also a drug dealer whose product contributed to one of the worst addiction epidemics in American history. The heroin crisis of the 1970s destroyed lives, families, and communities. Frank's blue magic was particularly devastating because it was so pure and so addictive. People who tried it often became hopelessly addicted. Overdoses were common. And the social fabric of Harlem, already strained by poverty and racism, was further torn apart by addiction. Frank's wealth came directly from this suffering. In the end, Frank Lucas was a man of contradictions. A criminal and an entrepreneur. A community benefactor and a community destroyer. A man who challenged the racist system, but did so by poisoning his own people. A snitch who violated the street code, but exposed police corruption. A legend and a cautionary tale. His story remains fascinating, precisely because it contains all these contradictions, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about crime, race, poverty, and the American dream. Frank Lucas was born on September 9, 1930, in LaGrange, North Carolina, and died on May 30, 2019. In Cedar Grove, New Jersey, at age 88. He served approximately 13 years total in federal prison. Was released finally in 1991 and lived quietly for nearly 3 decades before his death. His story was immortalized in the 2007 film American Gangster. He is remembered as one of the most notorious and innovative drug dealers in American history.